The Capitol, Washington, D.C. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with something unsaid. Inside the marble halls of Congress, routine ticked on like an old clock. Pages shuffled, staffers hurried, but beneath the surface, something taut pulled at every breath. Mike Johnson sat at his desk like a king surveying his court. Papers stacked in front of him like weapons. His navy suit was pressed, his tie symmetrical. His ambition, however, was messy. Across the room, Jasmine Crockett took her seat. No grand gestures, no entourage, just a woman with eyes that had seen too much to blink easily. Her lapel bore a silver pin, small and quiet, a symbol only the observant would understand. It was not for show. It was a promise, a silent vow to every unheard voice she'd ever carried. The hearing was about equity reform. On paper, a procedural review. In reality, a battleground. Johnson's words dripped with smiles but cut like razors. Jasmine knew the playbook. She had heard those tones in courtrooms, classrooms, campaign stops. They always began with, "Let's be fair," and ended with silence. He spoke of fairness. He spoke of tradition. He spoke of people earning their place. But Jasmine listened beyond the words. She heard the scaffolding of supremacy being rebuilt one sentence at a time. Jasmine waited. She didn't interrupt. She didn't roll her eyes. She let him climb, brick by rhetorical brick, higher into the fortress of his own certainty. And then, when the pause came, when his voice dipped into that smug lull that signaled the end of his performance, Jasmine stood. The room stilled. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She revealed. "Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee," she began, voice measured, clear, "I have listened carefully to the remarks presented here today. And while I appreciate the passion with which my colleague speaks, passion must never be allowed to substitute for truth." In a single breath, the tone shifted. She began unraveling his arguments, not with venom but with precision. Not with outrage but with evidence. Every statistic he had bent, she straightened. Every anecdote he'd cherry-picked, she balanced with reality. Her words weren't fireworks. They were flares, lit methodically to expose the terrain. Johnson fidgeted. He tried to cut in. "With all due respect, Congresswoman." But Jasmine didn't yield. "Respect," she said calmly, "is not optional. It's constitutional." One by one, her arguments peeled away the veneer of respectability Johnson had cloaked himself in. She wasn't there to win a debate. She was there to shine a light. She quoted real stories, real families, real veterans, real students, people who lived behind the walls of the policies being discussed. She called out what others wouldn't, that this wasn't about fairness. It was about fear, a fear of losing control, a fear of being held accountable. Justice, she said, voice rising just slightly, was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be courageous. Outside, the world was already stirring. Staffers in the back of the room raised phones discreetly. Live clips hit social media. Within minutes, the fire spread. Outside the courthouse, the slap had already echoed far beyond Charleston. What began as a moment, a raised hand and the stillness that followed, was now a storm rolling across social media, the airwaves, and into the lives of everyday people. A 30-second clip, raw and unfiltered, showed a man in uniform striking a seated black congresswoman. No spin, no voiceover, just reality. And that, it turned out, was more powerful than 1,000 opinion pieces. By nightfall, hashtags bloomed like wildfire across platforms. Hashtag justice for Jasmine. Hashtag she did not flinch. Hashtag power reckoned. TV anchors scrambled to change their evening lineups. Newspapers stopped their presses. What had been a routine courtroom hearing had transformed into a national reckoning. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't gone home. She remained in Charleston, refusing to vanish behind press statements or talking points. While others debated the meaning of her silence and the weight of that slap, she spent the evening meeting quietly with local organizers. Grassroots leaders, mothers who had lost sons to silence. Daughters who had grown up knowing the truth would not always protect them. In a community center with peeling paint and mismatched chairs, Jasmine listened more than she spoke. Each story she heard stitched itself onto the lining of her resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. Maybe it never was. She was the vessel through which decades of frustration had poured, and now the world had heard the first drop. By morning, the courthouse was surrounded, not by rioters or mobs, but by candle holders. Dozens, then hundreds, stood in silent vigil. Black, white, young, old, some with signs, some with nothing but their presence. They didn't chant, they didn't scream, they stood, shoulder to shoulder, in unbroken silence. Inside, Travis Boone sat alone in a holding room, his hands shaking more now than they had when he struck Jasmine. Not from fear of justice, but from the horror of seeing himself clearly for the first time. He hadn't expected the world to care. He had expected silence to protect him again. But the ripple had become a wave. In Los Angeles, a young girl saw the video and asked her mother, why didn't she hit him back? The mother knelt and answered softly, because sometimes strength is standing still. In Chicago, a high school teacher scrapped his lesson plan and showed the video in class. One student, who never spoke, whispered. She looked at him like he wasn't bigger than her. Like he was already small. In New York, on the subway walls, someone spray-painted in looping cursive. She did not flinch. And across the country, something was shifting. This wasn't about party lines anymore. It wasn't about red or blue, about pundits or policy. It was about power. Who had it? Who abused it? And who finally dared to stand in its path without blinking? That evening, Jasmine stood again. Not in a courtroom, not in Congress, but on the steps of the courthouse, facing a sea of people who had come not for spectacle but for clarity. The candles flickered like stars drawn to earth. The cameras were there too, but she didn't look at them. She looked into the crowd. Into the eyes of the old man in a veteran's cap. The young girl with a spiral notebook clutched to her chest. The exhausted nurse still in scrubs. And when she spoke, she did not yell. I'm not asking you to be angry, she said. I'm asking you to be awake. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The system didn't break yesterday, she continued. It showed us what it's always been willing to protect. And we're not here to beg it to change. We're here to remind it that it serves us, not the other way around. Applause broke out, soft at first, then growing. But she lifted her hand gently. The crowd stilled. Don't let this moment die with a hashtag, she said. Let it live in your voting booth, in your courtroom, in your school board meeting, in how you treat the person no one else sees. Her voice wavered just once. But she steadied it. They didn't expect me to show up, she said. But I did. They didn't expect me to stand still. But I did. And now it's your turn. That night, no riot broke out. No windows shattered, but hearts cracked open. Minds shifted, and across the country, people began to stand, one by one, in courthouses, in classrooms, in living rooms. The wave was growing, and Jasmine Crockett? She was no longer just standing in it. She was leading it. The morning after Jasmine Crockett's speech, the United States awoke differently. In D.C., the streets buzzed with reporters scrambling to cover not another scandal, not another gaffe, but a reckoning. On the steps of Capitol Hill, interns whispered her name. Journalists asked whether a new voice had entered the pantheon of political giants. And in the back rooms of power, where strategy overrode soul, Jasmine Crockett was suddenly the name everyone either feared, respected, or both. Not since the marches of the 1960s had a single moment united so many people across race, class, and ideology. But this was different. It wasn't just what happened in that courtroom, it was how Jasmine stood. Still, silent, fierce. That moment became something more than viral. It became sacred. In Georgia, a state senator stood up and changed the vote she had planned to cast. In Texas, a pastor rewrote his entire Sunday sermon. She did not flinch, he repeated, over and over. And neither shall we. In a high-rise boardroom in New York, A Fortune 500 CEO sent an internal memo to every employee. Today, we reconsider our training, our hiring, our partnerships. Jasmine Crockett reminded us that silence is complicity. She had never asked to be a symbol. But the nation had made her one anyway. Not out of projection, but recognition. People saw in her what they wished they'd had in their own moment of trial. She wasn't perfect. She was something better. Unyielding. In the Senate chamber that afternoon, a bill that had languished for months suddenly gained traction. The Civil Accountability and Protection Act, CAPA, they called it, had been stalling. Too radical, too ambitious, they'd said. But Jasmine's presence in that courtroom changed the calculus. Now, senators who once rolled their eyes at the bill's co-sponsors were calling emergency briefings. Now, networks were broadcasting the bill's language line by line. Now, the people had a face for the fight, and they would not let it go unseen. Meanwhile, Travis Boone was suspended without pay. But that wasn't what he feared most. What terrified him, what kept him up at night, was not the punishment but the shift. The way even those who had once defended him now avoided his gaze. The way his badge, once an untouchable shield, now felt heavy and exposed. In private, he rewatched the footage. Not to justify it, to understand it. To understand how he, a man who had believed himself decent, had become a symbol of something so indefensible. And Jasmine? She didn't celebrate. She didn't rest. She drafted a statement, not for herself, but for every woman who had sat in silence. For every man imprisoned by a justice system designed to forget him. For every child growing up wondering what their skin would cost them. Her team urged caution. You've done enough for now, they said. Let the moment breathe. But Jasmine had no interest in breath without purpose. The air is already thick with injustice, she replied. I'm not here to exhale. I'm here to speak. That evening, she stepped onto a late-night news set. The anchor, grizzled and typically unshakable, paused before asking the first question. You didn't flinch, he said. How? Jasmine smiled, not warmly, not coldly. Steadily. Because I wasn't standing alone, she said. I carried every name no one else remembers. And they held me up. By the end of that week, murals had started appearing. In Baltimore, a towering wall bore Jasmine's silhouette. One hand by her side, one eye locked forward. In Oakland, a subway tunnel was painted with the words, "She did not flinch. So now we won't either." In Milwaukee, a librarian cleared space for a new shelf. Voices that stood still. Jasmine's name was the first. In the South, a sheriff's department quietly updated its training policies. In the Midwest, a judge reopened a case he had long buried in paperwork. In the North, a school district renamed its annual Civic Engagement Award, the Jasmine Crockett Honor. And across the internet, in the quiet of midnight posts and early morning coffee reflections, people weren't arguing. They were remembering the moment the courtroom paused. Remembering the moment America did too. The slap had caused the spark. But it was Jasmine's stillness that started the fire. The morning headlines read like tributes, but behind every glowing article, every viral clip, every reverent retweet, there was a price Jasmine Crockett had already begun to pay. Fame was never the goal. Influence was never the motive. Jasmine knew better than anyone that the truth often demands something in return, and it rarely asks for permission before taking it. That Friday, Jasmine's inbox swelled with interview requests, panel invites, honorary mentions. But tucked between them were darker messages. Anonymous threats. Half-sentences drenched in hate. You should have stayed silent. We're watching you. The courtroom is not your stage. Her staff grew nervous. They added new layers of security. Changed her travel routes. Screened her calls. But Jasmine, though exhausted, remained undeterred. I'm not afraid, she told them. But I am prepared. She didn't sleep much that night. Not because of fear, but because of weight. The kind only carried by those who have stood up and stayed standing while others fall silent. By Monday, the backlash had a face. Congressman Randall Sykes, a frequent guest on conservative networks, went on air calling Jasmine's testimony a masterclass in emotional manipulation. He claimed she weaponized her identity to push an agenda, and warned that Congress was becoming a theater for grievance instead of governance. His words echoed far and wide. The next day, Jasmine walked into a committee hearing where 3 of her colleagues refused to acknowledge her presence. One shuffled papers louder than necessary. Another muttered, grandstanding, under his breath. It didn't matter. She sat tall, her hands folded in calm defiance. But the backlash didn't stop there. On Wednesday, a national columnist, once an ally, questioned her intentions. Was Jasmine Crockett standing for justice? Or positioning for the next election? The words stung more than she expected. Not because they were true, but because they were designed to cast doubt on the very people she represented. If she stood quietly, she was complicit. If she stood boldly, she was opportunistic. That was the trap, and she refused to step into it. Instead, she requested the floor in a late-session debate on racial equity in policing. And she spoke. She spoke not to defend her name, but to defend the names never spoken. The names lost in reports. The names written in chalk on sidewalks and whispered in courtrooms before vanishing under red tape. Her voice was calm, measured, stronger than before. Not because she had something to prove, but because they were trying so hard to silence her. Outside the Capitol, protesters gathered. Some in support, some in outrage. One sign read, "She stood for U.S." Another, "Sit down, Jasmine." The tension in the air was no longer just political. It was personal, a reckoning too long delayed, a mirror too hard to face. That week, Jasmine received a letter from a mother in St. Louis. "My son was killed last year in a traffic stop. They said he reached for something, but he never carried anything but his student ID. I saw you stand. And for the first time, I felt like someone stood for him, too. Thank you." Jasmine held the letter in trembling hands. This was why she endured the hate. This was why she withstood the doubt. Because the truth has a price. And it's worth every drop of peace it costs. In a private meeting with her closest staff, Jasmine said what they had all been feeling. "They'll come for me harder now. Not because I'm wrong, but because I'm right, and I'm a mirror they can't look away from." Her chief of staff leaned forward. "Then let's give them something worth looking at." And just like that, they returned to the work. Because while the world debated her courage, Jasmine Crockett wasn't waiting to be canonized. She was already writing the next speech, reading the next bill, preparing the next stand. She didn't need applause. She needed change. The great marble halls of Congress had stood for centuries. They had witnessed declarations of war and peace, compromise and betrayal, speeches that echoed for generations, and many more that died the moment they were spoken. But on this day, even the stone seemed to hold its breath, as if straining to preserve the weight of what had been said. Jasmine Crockett's voice had long since stopped echoing down the corridors, but the silence that followed had a shape. It was not absence, it was presence, and it lingered. Inside the halls, conversations returned, first in murmurs, then in sharp bursts. A few aides scrambled to retrieve transcripts. One lawmaker, visibly shaken, replayed a video on his phone, again and again, as if to confirm the clarity of what he had just witnessed. And still, no one could quite speak of it plainly. Jasmine hadn't just rebuked a colleague or set the record straight, she had cracked open something deeper. Something the institution itself had built walls to contain. But institutions remember, even when they pretend not to. The echo of her words drifted through hallways that had once silenced women and shunned the voices of the marginalized. Now those same walls carried her cadence in their bones. Mike Johnson's office sat quiet, the door closed. Inside, his advisors gathered in terse, low voices. The performance he had intended, a confident dressing down of so-called entitlement, had backfired with searing clarity. The headlines didn't read like he'd hoped. The clips circulating weren't of his opening monologue. They were of her. He shuffled papers with more force than necessary. One aide attempted to frame the moment as a PR pivot opportunity, but the room had already surrendered to reality. Jasmine hadn't just countered his narrative. She had redefined it, and that sting, the humiliation of being not just challenged but replaced as the voice of reason, was worse than defeat. In contrast, Jasmine moved quietly through the halls. She wasn't chasing interviews. She wasn't posing. She had made her stand, and now she let it breathe. Some nodded when they saw her. Others couldn't meet her eyes. A few whispered, "Thank you," as she passed. The janitor in the West Wing tipped his hat and said, "Ma'am, that's the first time in a long time someone said what needed saying in there." Jasmine paused. "Thank you," she said, gently. "That means everything." She knew it wasn't over. Not the resistance, not the misrepresentations, but something had shifted, and even the ones who wouldn't say it aloud felt it in their gut. In the basement cafeteria, two interns argued over whether this was the kind of moment that made a real difference. One said no, nothing ever really changed. The other disagreed. "It's not that it all changes at once," she said, tapping her phone screen to replay Jasmine's speech. "It's that we remember who made us believe it could." Upstairs, a historian who had spent decades cataloging the most forgettable floor speeches leaned back in his chair and scribbled a note in the margin of his current book draft. Jasmine Crockett's address, potential turning point in minority policy rhetoric. Watch for legacy. In that way, her words kept moving, quietly, stubbornly, like roots growing beneath stone. What Jasmine had done wasn't just political. It was architectural. She had shifted the foundation beneath the ritual. And though many would pretend otherwise in the days to come, trying to dismiss her as emotional or manipulative, others had already begun building on the cracks she'd made. She returned to her office as twilight settled over D.C. and glanced at the framed quote on the wall, a gift from a teacher during her first campaign. "History is not what happened. It is what we remember." And in those hallowed halls, no one could forget. Not now. By morning, the fog rolling over the Potomac had begun to lift, but something else lingered in the air, heavier than mist. Jasmine Crockett sat at her desk, the same chair where so many battles had begun quietly. Only this time, the silence didn't feel like waiting. It felt like aftermath. Stacks of folders lay unopened before her, legislation, amendments, case studies. But her eyes were fixed on the screen in front of her. A flood of messages, tens of thousands, emails, letters, voicemails, social posts, all bearing the same undercurrent. "I saw you. You spoke for us. Don't stop." She scrolled through them slowly, carefully. Veterans, teachers, mothers, activists, even disillusioned bureaucrats who had spent decades going through motions, now stirred awake by a voice that felt like their own. One message caught her breath. "My father never voted. He said it didn't matter. Yesterday, he asked me how to register. Thank you." She closed her eyes. The fire was catching. It hadn't been her intention to light one. Not like this. But perhaps that was why it had worked. Because it was never about a viral moment or a speech destined for a montage. It was about a lifetime of pressure. About showing up again and again, even when no one was watching. And then, when the moment finally came, refusing to flinch. That refusal had done something no prepared speech ever could. It had kindled something ancient. In churches, sermons were rewritten overnight. In high schools, teachers printed out Jasmine's speech and asked students to analyze what truth sounds like when it breaks protocol. On late-night television, hosts, usually allergic to sincerity, dropped their usual snark and simply replayed the clip, letting it speak for itself. A movement had not begun. It had revealed itself, and now it was hungry. Jasmine stood from her desk, walking to the window. Below her, the Capitol loomed, columns, flags, glass, and stone. But it no longer looked untouchable. Not like it had when she first walked these halls. It looked ready. Ready for the next conversation. The next confrontation. The next truth. Because the fire she had sparked was no longer hers to control. It belonged to the people now. It lived in dinner-table arguments, in whispered confessions, in children asking their parents questions they couldn't answer. The system, as always, would resist. It would regroup, try to spin, to dilute, to delay. But the ground had shifted. Somewhere, Mike Johnson sat in his own office, haunted not by rage, but by irrelevance. The storm he thought he could weather had passed, but it had left behind new terrain, and he no longer knew how to walk it. Jasmine returned to her desk. The first bill she pulled into her lap wasn't flashy. It wouldn't trend. It was about food security in overlooked neighborhoods. But she smiled, because this was the work. The fire she had lit wasn't a blaze meant to burn down the house. It was a hearth, a place where voices gathered, where light reached corners long ignored, where change, real change, didn't arrive as spectacle, but as sustained warmth. That was her legacy, not the speech, not the headlines, but the proof, etched now in marble and memory, that one voice, spoken with truth, could shift the air, could change the course, could stay lit, and Jasmine Crockett would carry that fire forward, every day, until every shadow in those halls knew its name, until silence, once a shield of power, became an unbearable void. Because once the fire was lit,